A tip. We began our own investigation following the trail of these suspected con artists. Their strategy, some claim, is to win the trust of the elderly and then take control of their homes, their possessions, sometimes their life savings. Catherine Cryer's report raises an important concern for older people living alone: how to distinguish between a helpful neighbor and a dangerous friend.
This lawyer and her associate are searching for evidence of a crime.
Look at this. Here's a torn-up check with Ronnie's name on it.
The old man who lived in this apartment was befriended by a young woman and her relatives, whom police have characterized as members of a gypsy family suspected of criminal activity. They did errands for him and helped around the house.
Oh, this is unbelievable. How could anyone live in this?
They brought him medicine and food.
Look at this. Guy was eating out of cans.
And he handed over to them his life savings, $180,000. 90-year-old Jim Callahan is now destitute, living in a nursing home.
Okay, thank you.
He says his new young friends talked him out of his money with hard luck stories about hospital bills and unpaid rent.
Right now is about the worst I've ever felt in my life. I don't sleep, I don't eat.
After allegations of fraud were made in court, a judge appointed a guardian to look after Jim Callahan, and police opened an investigation. But Callahan may be lucky. He only lost his money. We've come across other cases with a similar MO involving members of another gypsy family, the Teenies, befriending the elderly, ending up with cash, cars, houses. But some of their old friends have died under suspicious circumstances.
Let's be perfectly honest here. The evidence clearly suggests that he was poisoned.
Murder.
Yes, I think my uncle was murdered, yes.
James Blasto's 85-year-old Uncle Andrew lived alone in New York City, rarely seeing family and friends. In the fall of 1993, he disappeared. James called emergency services and learned that his uncle was in the intensive care unit at Bellevue Hospital, mysteriously overdosed on sedatives, barbiturates, and painkillers. James rushed over to see him, but was stunned to find out that someone had barred the way.
And I asked why. And the bureaucracy at Bellevue Hospital in New York said that the wife permits no visitors. I said, what wife? He has no wife. He's not married. He's never been married.
Andrew Vlasto, a lifelong bachelor, had indeed taken a wife. This woman, Sylvia Mitchell. She had a marriage license showing she was 28, 57 years younger than Andrew. 3 weeks into his hospital stay, Andrew's condition was improving, but then he was rushed back to intensive care. Doctors were confounded by a discovery. Andrew had been given a powerful drug they did not prescribe, digoxin, also known as digitalis. It's used to regulate an erratic heartbeat. If taken improperly, experts say, it can kill you. The day after doctors discovered the digoxin, Andrew died.
As soon as my uncle died, I did everything I could to make sure that an autopsy was going to be held.
But Sylvia, Andrew's young widow, tried to block the autopsy. She failed. The autopsy report states he died from a drug overdose complicated by pneumonia. There is no determination at this point that digoxin contributed to his death, but authorities are still investigating. And so is James Blasto.
You have to keep in mind that this whole episode between marriage and death took 82 days.
And boy, oh boy, what a mess. Holy cow.
We recently accompanied him to Andrew's apartment in search of clues and to learn more about the way Andrew lived.
He was a loner and cheap, tight, didn't spend any money on anything, on clothes, on food, on furniture, nothing. He didn't spend a dime.
Over a lifetime as a banker, a journalist, and a businessman, Andrew had accumulated $250,000 and real estate in his native Greece. But marriage must have changed the man. He and his young bride headed to the glittering Taj Mahal casino in Atlantic City, wiring $70,000 from his bank account, now jointly owned by Sylvia. Sylvia collected the money in cash. Andrew's neighbor, who saw him regularly, was shocked to learn about the trip.
He went to Atlantic City? Is that what they said? Somebody said?
Lots of money and the new wife and off to Atlantic City?
Again, that's so uncharacteristic. It's very difficult for me to believe that.
As all this was going on, bankers, relatives, neighbors, did anyone check up on him? Did anyone see what was going on?
No. Nobody knew.
Except perhaps this man, Sylvia's longtime companion. His name is Tom Teeney, and he's a convicted con man. 2020 has learned that at the same time she was married to Andrew Vlasto, Sylvia apparently lived above this store with Tom Teeney and their children. Is this the woman that lived next door?
Yeah.
No question about it.
No. That's it.
But here they use the names Tom and Tina Goldman. It's a pattern. Between them, they've apparently used at least 10 names and 10 addresses in 3 years. Let me show you a picture of this woman. Do you recognize her?
Yes, that's Sylvia Taney, used to live here.
All right, no question about it?
No question.
Soon after Andrew's death, they rented and ultimately were evicted from an apartment owned by Tex Fitzsimons in New Jersey, under what may be their real names, Sylvia and Tom Teeney. They said they were expecting an inheritance.
Well, they told me that his father died, that he had a lot of money, that he owned apartment houses or something in Greece, and apparently from a little bit I got from them, it was like a millionaire's estate, you know, so...
Sounds like Andrew Vlasto's estate. He owned real estate in Greece. In fact, a woman who lived there spoke to Sylvia on the phone about Andrew's death and recorded their conversation.
How did Andrew die? I have, pretty good idea and pretty good suspicion as to how, but it's not confirmed yet. I just know that he was neglected at the hospital.
Sylvia and Tom Teeney have disappeared. Their last known address, this mail drop in New Jersey. But across the country, in San Francisco, we found some of their cousins, members of the same Gypsy family, who investigators say have made a virtual business out of collecting from one old friend after another. This is Angela, also known as Teresa Teeney. She lives with her boyfriend, George Lama. The Mercedes you see, it's registered to George and a 94-year-old friend who died. And the house? It used to belong to 87-year-old Nicholas Bufford. He signed a deed making Angela co-owner of the property. She was listed as his granddaughter. Then they got married.
The next month, they went back to the county recorder's office and recorded another document that said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. This isn't my granddaughter, it's my wife." And the next month, he was dead.
Faye Farron is a private eye in San Francisco. She has spent months investigating the activities of George, Angela, and Angela's family, and says Angela may have learned from her mother. Mary Steiner, also known as Bessie Teeney, married an 89-year-old man who left her this house and his entire estate at his death. While still married, she befriended another 89-year-old who gave her this $1 million apartment building. And then there's Angela's brother, Danny Teeney, also known as Sal Lamance. He befriended a 79-year-old widow who made him co-owner of this house, then later sued him, claiming she'd been defrauded. Danny Teeney denies any wrongdoing. The lawsuit is pending. But it's Angela who appears to be the most active member of the family. After the death of her 87-year-old husband, she became friends with this man, Stephen Storvik, a retired longshoreman in his late 80s. He lived above this deli where Angela used to waitress.
He told me that he developed a close relationship with Angela, and he liked Angela very much.
Chell Beaumark Noel is a lawyer and was a friend of Stephen Storvik. He says Angela and George used to bring Storvik food, but Storvik grew suspicious.
He felt that he was being poisoned, and one morning he told me he woke up totally stiff, he couldn't move.
What did he think the cause?
He thought they were putting something in his food.
Stephen Storvik was so convinced of a plot against him that he told the police George and Angela had drugged him and were out to get his money. No charges were ever filed. Storvik made a new will. And that will specifically excluded who?
Angela Buford.
Stephen Storvik moved away. He died in 1992, leaving nothing to Angela. His death was attributed to lung cancer, but police are investigating. Private Eye Faye Farron says that in 1993, she got a tip that Angela and George had found 2 new targets.
When I talked to the police, they knew about this, and I said, well, who are the victims? And they said, well, we don't know. And I talked to them later and said, well, did you find out who the victims are? No, we don't know.
So Farron and her associates followed Angela here to the home of a 93-year-old friend. They videotaped Angela as she arrived and entered the house. And they followed George to the home of a 94-year-old, the man with whom George owned his Mercedes. As with Stephen Storvik, George and Angela brought food to these elderly men.
This was definitely not Meals on Wheels.
This woman, who wishes to remain anonymous, was a friend of Harry Glover Hughes, the man George was visiting. She believes that Angela and George deliberately isolated her friend.
They changed his phone number to an unlisted phone number.
Did that make any sense?
Not to me, it didn't.
Nor did it make sense that George Lama's name was put on Hughes' bank accounts. Faye Farron says she was worried about Hughes and Richard Nelson, Angela's friend. Farron went to check up on Nelson. Who answered the door? Angela.
And she told me that, oh, he was just fine, that he'd slipped and he'd fallen a few days before, but he was fine now.
An informant told the police George and Angela were poisoning Nelson and others with a dangerous heart drug. And guess what? The man who owns this pharmacy told 2020 George Lama bought large quantities of the heart drug digoxin from him. Remember, that's the same drug found in Andrew Vlasto in New York. Richard Nelson's doctor tested him for digoxin, which is also known as digitalis.
He went in and was tested and was found positive for digitalis.
Had the doctor ever prescribed digitalis for him?
No. And so they waited 2 weeks and they tested him again. And he had more digitalis in his blood.
Richard Nelson's relatives moved him out of his house and left no forwarding address. Yet Angela paid a visit to his new home. There are now strict orders she is not to be let in again. Harry Glover Hughes' family was also alerted. A guardian was appointed after officials stated in court that Hughes was prey to Angela and George. He died of a cerebral hemorrhage last spring and was cremated. Around that time, investigators began exhuming bodies, citing a reasonable possibility that the deaths were caused or hastened by drugs surreptitiously administered by those who hoped to profit from their demise. They dug up the body of Stephen Storvik, the man who told police George and Angela tried to drug him. They exhumed Nicholas Bufford, Angela's husband. They even exhumed the bodies of the two elderly men who left valuable properties to Angela's mother. Police are tight-lipped about the tests performed on the bodies, but 2020 has obtained this official report showing there was digoxin in Nicholas Bufford's body at the time of his death.
Despite these suspicious circumstances, no one has been charged with a crime. In fact, there's been no official determination that anyone was even murdered. The San Francisco Police Department has refused to comment on the case. We tried to talk to Angela Bufford and George Lama. They declined. But in a letter to 2020, a lawyer for Angela said his client and anyone associated with her are innocent of any wrongdoing, and that there is no poison, no murder, and no suspicious death.
One of the detectives said to me, well, Faye, you know they're being poisoned and we know they're being poisoned, but sometimes these things just fall through the cracks.
Back in New York City, James Blasto is just as frustrated with the authorities investigating his Uncle Andrew's death.
Privately, they've said that they feel that, yes, he was poisoned. Yes, he obviously was a victim of fraud, but it's hard to prove. Andrew Vlasto didn't have to die. Andrew Vlasto didn't have to die.
Catherine, the first question in my mind, and maybe in the minds of many, why is it so difficult for authorities to mount a case against this kind of action?
Well, when elderly are the victims of fraud in these sorts of cases, you look at their circumstances. Oftentimes they live alone. They have few friends, no family around, no one's watching over. In some instances, they've become forgetful. Someone pays them a lot of attention, and they seem to give them their property willingly. So it's very difficult to then get testimony, get witnesses to put together a case.
That does make it a little tough. But any idea how widespread this is?
We know the population in this country is aging tremendously. There are going to be more and more people over the age of 85. Many times they move away from families, retire alone, and become very easy targets for frauds, for scams. And unfortunately, the problem is growing by leaps and bounds.
It's still very big and getting bigger. Thank you, Catherine.
Well, next, the trouble with taking a risk. Sometimes you lose. These teenagers did when they played on the train tracks. And so did this railroad worker when she blamed their deaths on her employer.